couple things to bring you up to speed on. Coeymans is going to be participating in a 250th celebration of our independence, and that event is going to take place July 10th, 11th, and 12th. So there's 3 different phases. On the 10th is going to be a block party in Mosier Park. July 11th is going to be a parade. We're not sure of the route yet, and then it will end at Coeymans Landing with a big celebration. There'll be music vendors, reenactors, fife and drum, a bunch of other. We're still in the planning stages, so there's a lot more coming for that. And then that evening there'll be fireworks down off the river. And this will take place at the Friendship Festival that would normally have happened just before Labor Day. So that won't happen this year. Upcoming speakers. All right, and continuing with our Red War speaking, on March 8th, Trip Powell and John Bonifati will talk about the Revolutionary War encampment at Coeymans. April 12th, Aaron Mayer, he will talk about the Battle of Normanskill and the proposed monument that they're going to place there. September 13th, our own Dennis Whalen will be speaking to us on a topic that he's yet to give us. October 11th, Jesse Sarah Filippi, the story of Deborah Sampson. If you don't know who Deborah Sampson is, she was a woman who disguised herself as a man so that she could serve in the Continental Army. So that should be an interesting talk. And then November will be our normal open house. And with that, I'll introduce our speaker. Kyle Griffin has been a board member for the last 4 years. Kyle's a graduate of SUNY Plattsburgh. He worked at the New York State for 35 years in finance. He's got an accounting degree. And a couple of years ago, Kyle started doing a little bit of research and went down the rabbit hole and went through all kinds of pensioning records and all kinds of stuff, and he's come up with what he's going to speak about today. So with that, I will give you Kyle.
Set. Make sure is it working? All right. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for coming today for Coeymans Connections to the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1777. I'm Kyle Griffin, and I can tell you my interest in history came about from finding an old Civil War letter amongst our old family belongings, and it was an 1863 letter written from Warrenton, Virginia, by an uncle of my great-grandmother's who we never knew about. It was Captain David Burhans from Bethlehem. But it got me into researching and realizing how easy it is to find all these old documents online. Like we're going to see today, there's a couple century-old documents that the National Archives started to digitalize all their pension records as far back as the 70s by photographing every single pension file and all the pages in them and putting them on big reels of microfilm. And then later they digitalize all the microfilm so that all those records are available to us today right at home through your internet, which is pretty interesting, I think. So it makes it easy to find, and the search engines and everything are pretty incredible. They're a lot smarter than you kind of think they are. So this is what our presentation is going to be about, from veterans of widow pensions to the first-hand accounts from residents of Coeymans Patent, commencing with the first shots fired at Lexington in 1775, to the militia troops patrolling Coeymans Patent, and we'll end today's presentation with the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. So our presentation today will cover the people of Coeymans Patent in the area before the Revolution, the pension acts and information typically found in the veteran pension files. We're going to recognize the Revolutionary War soldiers that resided in Coeymans Patent during the war. We're going to look at military activity of the local soldiers, the pensioners, starting with the outbreak of hostilities in Lexington near Boston, April 75, Johnstown, New York in January of 76, the Northern New York preparedness and militia patrols in Coeymans Patent from 76 to 77, Saratoga campaign in 77, And we'll close out the presentation by recognizing the Revolutionary War soldiers that resided in Coeymans Patent after the war. So, move on now. So now we'll take a look at Coeymans Patent, the area before the Revolution. We'll look at some of the locations where the indigenous settlements were and where their hunting areas were in and near the Coeymans Patent area. And some of the people living here and the roads and paths that cut through the area. So now we have a map showing Coeymans Patent. The boundaries, you can see it's the red outline there. And you can also see how the two counties of Albany and Rensselaer County are kind of outlined there. That's all part of the original manor of Rensselaer, and those county lines stand today. It was purchased by Baron Coeymans from the Mohican Indians, and the patent was granted by Governor Lovelace in 1673. So Coeymans Patent stretched along the Hudson from what's now Bethlehem to Coxsackie, and included the modern towns of Coeymans and Baltimore, Greenville, and Westerlo. So originally Coeymans Patent went from today's northern boundary with Bethlehem, and then down to the Coxsackie Creek, down just north of Coxsackie. And then they were given the water rights to Coxsackie Creek down in the Green County, Coxsackie area. And then this would all have been part of the original purchase of Coeymans Patent back in 1673. So here are some locations of the indigenous settlements and the hunting areas that were around in Coeymans Patent before the war. So you'll see Westerlo off to the northwestern tip of Coeymans Patent. The IF for Indian Fields, the AL for Alcove, AQ for Aquatuck. And those other shaded regions there, the bottom one to the south would be the Crabapple Lake exhibit, archaeological site that had been done recently, and there's an exhibit here that shows 10,000 years of continuous indigenous settlement in this area. And to the north was the Goes farm site through the Bloemkill that was done back in the 80s. And they both found similar things of thousands of years of indigenous people living in the area after the Ice Age, which was probably 15,000 years ago. And you can see the creek here that the Hanacroy runs from the Hudson through that hunting area. And there was probably a path that the Indians would have taken regularly along the Hanacroy to get to Aquatuck, Alcove Indian Fields, and further out to Westerlo. And so those hunting areas would be a place they'd come. And there were ravines, like so there'd be ravines with these creeks, and they would force their prey down into these ravines and surround them and hunt their prey in that manner, and use all these areas were probably all pretty much settled, or at least used by the indigenous through their seasons. However, they would maintain a winter residence, and summer residence might be in different places. But that kind of shows us where we know we've had from past research some of the Indian settlements going into the Revolutionary War. So here's a couple of maps. Roads in Coeymans, roads in Coeymans, just based on the spelling that they're using in these old maps. So the first map on the left is from Captain Montresor in 1775 and updated in 1777. And on the right is the Sauthier map of New York State in 1779. You'll see they both pretty much show this, at least all the maps from back then show the same idea of this kind of a loop here where you have a river road going south out of Albany down to Coeymans. Then it pops out of Coeymans and goes up probably Martins Hill and hits Coxsackie up in the flatlands, more a little west of the Hudson. And then there's always another loop coming down southwest out of Albany. Nesconta would be Enuscathaw today, and this road would be kind of going under the cliffs, crosses the Hanacroy out by Collins Flats, and comes back down near Coxsackie. You can see with the other map on the right, the same idea of the two loops, or the one loop with the road going down the Hudson, and another one coming southwest out of Albany and down through Enuscathaw, across the Hudson, or I'm sorry, across the Hanacroy. And then you see on the map on the right, they do have another road shown here. And what I've gotten from all these old maps is there's probably many roads, and these surveyors or map makers probably only were able to get a few of the roads in based on the time they had to do all this. So the map on the right does show also a road running out of the River Road and crossing both creeks and heading down into the Baltimore area of today's Greene County, probably around Medway, around there. So again, these were pretty standard type of maps looking for the Coeymans area and what the delineation of the boundaries look like. Again, the map on the right is probably more accurate. They don't really show that spoke coming up protecting the water power for the Coxsackie Creek. So, and then finally we got we'll take a look at some of the Coeymans patent residents shown in Bleeker's 1767 map here. So this map, I kind of had to turn around a little bit. So Hudson's on the bottom, and that orange line running like that would be the town boundary, the Bethlehem and Coeymans boundary. And so you'll see houses are numbered, if you can see them. We'll start with 1 and 2 at the bottom, Starlotta Coeymans. She lived in what was called the Coeymans Castle that was built in 1673 when Baron Coeymans first got the patent for the land. And that house stood until 1833. And then house number 2 on the bottom there is the Samuel Coeymans and his wife and the Verplanks lived in the same house. It was a big house. It still stands today. It's the Coeymans house, which was started in 1700. And then you'll see number 3 on the bottom, and that would be the homestead at Henry Tennite. That looked like it was right along the river also. Then we'll move out here, 137, 38, 39, Widow Andrus Whitbeck, Lender Whitbeck, Andrus Tennite. That would be out by today's Collins Flats, probably, where you see the road running along the creek. That's the Hannacroy. You'll see the Hannacroy continue out through Alcove in the hills out there, and then further out, way up there, 147, 148 is the bottom, Casper Fauser, and somebody with the last name Prize. That would be the Westerlo area. So I missed a couple here. 136 is empty. 135 was Tobias Tennite. 140 up above on that other colored road is William Holtellen. So again, this map also gives us a couple ideas of the roads. They do show that same loop coming down from Albany, both from the southwest under the cliffs and the River Road. And this one also has another road, the yellow line running south of the Coeymans Creek and probably running up towards 9W or the cement plant area back then, for whatever roads they had. So again, like I said, many of the roads back then weren't really going to make it to a map, because we do know, kind of like from this last slide, that you're not going to let me go. That along the Hannacroy also was probably a path, an Indian path that was probably one of the oldest paths in the area, since it led to some of the other locations of the Indian settlement area. So that's a quick look at what Coeymans was like a little bit before we get into the pension acts and the information typically found on a pension file. This is a jacket I called a pension jacket for Private Cornelius DeGroot, one of our local veterans, and it just summarizes he was serving Cornelius DeGroot, Albany County in the state of New York, was a private in the company commanded by Captain McCarty, with a regiment commanded by Colonel Van Dyke in New York for 8 months and a day. It was his total service. And it shows him getting a $26.77 annual pension. And so that, yes, annual pension, so about $2 a month. Not that much, but, well worth it. Well, let's move on. So we'll have the 4 pension acts. So they started as far back as 1818 doing pensions, and the first pension that you see listed there was only for Continental Line soldiers, the Federal Army. So only regular soldiers in the Continental Line were eligible for pensions under this act. Soldiers could enlist for a term of 1 to 3 years, and most applications are the veterans simply naming their company, the regimental officers in the state where they served. The records were really well kept by the Federal Continental Army, and it was quite easy from the pensions that to get approved just by listing the names of your officers. In 1820, though, they added the requirement for proof of financial need. The veterans had to prove that he and his family, if they had one, were in dire financial need by providing an inventory of all the property he owned and descriptions of the state of health of everyone in the household. And through those, you'll see, some kind of head shaking, inventories of people not having very much at all. They would list just having a few spoons and knives and a candle holder as their possessions, a shovel maybe, but not much. 1832 is where most of the information for today's presentation came from. It was when they lowered the requirement to at least 6 months service. So veterans applying under the Act of 1832, they were also required to appear before a court of record and provide oral testimony about their service by answering a standard set of standard series of War Department questions corroborated by at least one credible witness. So mind you, 1832 is about 50 years after the war ended. So we're talking 70-year-old, 80-year-old soldiers having to travel to Albany and provide testimony to get their pension. So it was, quite an ordeal, I think. And there were a few of them where they just couldn't make it. Their testimony from their lawyer would say that they cannot make the trip. They just can't go from Westerville to Albany in a wagon at 80 years old. So it was, it was hard to find them. We're lucky to have a lot of our pensioners because several of the ones used today died within a year of their pension of 1832 or 1833, whenever they submitted and got approved. We're lucky to have the information we got from them.
Do they still have to have financial need?
No, not in 1832. That was only with the 1820. Yeah, and that when they added that extra requirement, maybe after the first 2 years they had so many coming in, they want to kind of put a hold back on maybe people that, like today, maybe they're too rich to get a, a pension from the war. And they did put that extra requirement on. But in 1832, there was no financial disclosure of any sort like that. So then in 1836, the widows become eligible. And it was the last in the series of pension acts beginning in 1836, which widows and veterans married before the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 were eligible to apply for pensions. So those are the 4 acts. That's where all the information comes from. Most of it, again, was the 1832 Pension Act, and they have a lot of corroborating evidence and statements coming in from fellow soldiers that were still alive at that time. So from that, here's a typical, the questions that are asked for a pension. The U.S. Department, War Department questions posed to veterans include, where were you living when you were called into service? Where have you lived since the Revolutionary War, and where do you live now? How were you called into service? Were you drafted? Did you volunteer? Were you a substitute? State the names of some of the regular officers who were with the troops and where you served, and the general circumstances of the service. So these are generally answered throughout the pensions. And so that would give us all the extra peripheral information to help us get this list of soldiers that resided in Coeymans Patent during the Revolutionary War. So with a P after it, you'll see their pensioners. We have Levi Blaisdell, Nathan Cutler, Cornelius DeGroot, Andrew Haney, Thomas Holtelling, John Jones, David McCarty, Conrad T. Tonight, Daniel G. Van Antwerp, John T. Van Dalsen, Cornelius Vanderzee, Isaac Verplank, John L. Whitbeck, Daniel Wickham, and Peter W. Whitbeck. And as you see on the bottom, there's likely additional soldiers resided in Coeymans at that time during the war. Really didn't have any kind of census or population estimates of the Coeymans Patent at the time. We did just look at a map that showed some of the residents. That was by no means all the people living here. They were probably the most significant homes or farms in the area, and really shouldn't be seen as the only people. There's probably hundreds and hundreds of people living in Coeymans Patent at the time. Yeah.
Did they save their oral history?
Did they save their oral history?
When they were applying?
Yeah, well, it's written.
That's what I meant. Is it written somewhere?
Yeah, that's,
Oh, neat.
yeah, the pension files that are digitalized and available through the National Archives, if you know someone that is a pensioner, you can just type their name and it'll pop up for you. Now, the pension packages could, you know, especially the 1832 where there's more documentation needed, could minimum 40 pages, maybe 100 pages. So some of the 1818 ones that would, you only need to document their service for the Continental Line could have only been 5 pages for the whole pension package. So yeah, these are the pensioners. A lot of these people we knew ahead of time before the whole project started, like Andrew Haney, who's out by Westerlo, Thomas Hoteling, whose home was down by 9W in the New York State Thruway overpass. John Jones was someone never heard of, but then David McCarty is someone, anybody familiar with Coeymans is familiar with that name, as well as Conrad Penite. Daniel Van Antwerp was kind of a new find just through his through the other pension files of other soldiers, kept mentioning him as being out of this town and leading troops out of this town, which you'll see more of later. And then John Van Dalston, Cornelius Van der Zee, Isaac Erplank, they're all ones we knew of before, John Whitbeck and Peter Whitbeck. Both Levi and Daniel Wickham both moved to Coeymans in 1780 during the war. So let's move on now. So this is the Rensselaer Wake District regiments. So when the war was sort of getting going in October 75, this is after the first shots in Boston, and the colonial governor or province of New York is reorganizing from being under British command into the new Patriot armies of the 1775 we have for October 20th. So people from Coeymans would have been in the 4th Regiment, at least according to this. This is where we generally got the residents from Coeymans assigned. So under the 4th Regiment, 1st Company, we'll see Captain Conrad Tenite, 1st Lieutenant Peter Whitbeck, 2nd Lieutenant Albert Van der Zee, and Ensign John L. Whitbeck. So the highlighted ones are ones we know are from Coeymans, and Albert Van der Zee might have been just north of Coeymans and Bethlehem on Ryle Road where his father lived. So then we see with the 2nd Company, 4th Regiment at the bottom, Ensign Cornelius Van der Zee. Again, he was from Coeymans, but he was born on Ryle Road, probably, I think he's Albert's brother, and might have been serving out of his father's home at that time, because the other people in his company are William Whinney, John DeBow, and Phil Luke, it says Luke, but those would be people from the Bethlehem area. So on the right, they later had some more regimental changes, kind of like a shell game, they're always moving things around, and we'll see again the 1st Company of the 4th is now the 1st Company of the 5th, and it's Captain Conrad Tenite, 1st Lieutenant Peter Whitbeck, 2nd Lieutenant Daniel G. Van Antwerp, and Ensign John Verplank. So these again are local people from the Coeymans Patton area that resided here during the war, and they were officers of these companies within the 4th or 5th Regiment. Now there's another list from the book that shows the officer changes from April 78 to February 79. And again, you see Peter Whitbeck was Captain, Daniel Van Antwerp, 1st Lieutenant, Cornelius de Groot, 2nd Lieutenant Conrad Tenite, Ensign, and later in 79, Daniel Van Antwerp as a Captain, Cornelius de Groot, 1st Lieutenant, Conrad Tenite as a 2nd Lieutenant. So they're all becoming higher ranked officers during the war, and these things went on all through the war. We're only going to stop around at this point to kind of keep it within a framework. And also on the right, you'll see the Coxsackie group in block, the 11th Regiment, that would come out of that area. You'll see the highlighted name of the 11th Regiment, 1st Company is Thomas Hoteling from, again, Coeymans Patton at the time, now it's in Walthorne. Down at the bottom right, you'll see James Waldron. There was a James Waldron Sr. from Greenville, and then James Waldron Jr. that moved here, I think right at the end of the war. He's part of the family that lives up behind the RCS Senior High School, and their family burial ground is right by the bus garage up on the campus of RCS. So we're going to look at the following battles or military activity in today's presentation. I'm going to start with April 75 at the Battle of Lexington, 75-76, the preparation for expected northern invasion, the Battle of Valcour Island, We'll see action in January 76 at Johnstown, New York. In 76 and 77, patrols by Rangers at Indian Fields in Passaic, or today's West Willow area. And finally, we're going to close out the military activity with 77's Burgoyne's campaign, or the battles of Saratoga. So let's get right into the first shots fired at Lexington. Here's a nice engraving by Amos Doolittle that was made the year of the first shots fired at Lexington by the British militia. So we're going to introduce you now to Ensign Levi Blaisdell. He was born in Amesbury, 1757, and in 1780 he moved to Coeymans and married in 1782 Mary Augusta Coeymans Verplank. Levi enlisted in Amesbury, Massachusetts in April 75 and marched on April 19th the same year to Cambridge and Prospect Hill for the Battle of Lexington, the first significant battle in the Revolutionary War. 3 generations of Blaisdells were serving in the War for Independence at the same time. 18-year-old Levi, his 39-year-old father Oliver, and 58-year-old grandfather Samuel. So quite a scene probably to have the 3 generations all marching to war. So here's about a quick look at the Battle of Lexington. What you see is Amesbury down to Lexington. It's a 45-mile march. Levi Blaisdell's pension application included an attestation from his brother, John, who stated that in the year 75, we enlisted together in Captain Timothy Barnard's company of Minutemen. And on the day of Lexington battle, on hearing the alarm, we marched with said company to Cambridge. So the alarm, I'm guessing, is lots of bells and drums and lots of noise, lots of anxiety, and a lot of nervousness about what's about to happen. But that was a quick look, just to get you started with the Battle of Lexington. Next up, we're going to hit Johnstown in 76, and again, northern New York and western Albany County. So through those affairs, those military activities, we're going to hear some testimony from Private Cornelius DeGroot at the 1776 going out to Johnstown, New York. Him again up in northern New York, along with Ensign Levi Blaisdell coming out of Amesbury, Massachusetts. And we'll end up looking at some of this activity in Indian Fields and what was called Passaic before Westerlo. Soldiers Sergeant Ethan Cutler, Private Cornelius DeGroot, Private John Vanderpool, and Private Martin C. Van Buren. He wasn't the president. He's probably old enough to be the president's father, but he wasn't the president's father either, but he's probably related. He's from Schodack, not far from Kinderhook. But it does have that name, so.
In February 1776, I went with the rest of my company from Coeymans. We were ordered out en masse under Captain David McCarty. We went in sleighs to Johnstown to apprehend the Tories collecting there under Sir John Johnson. I was actually on duty at that time, 12 days.
I should probably give you a little heads up on that, but yes, we have privileged today to have volunteers from the museum that did voices for 3 of the different soldiers that we're going to be seeing today. And that was Cornelius DeGroot, who was born in Athens. I think I should have prepped it a little better, but he was from Coeymans and took that march out. Actually, he took sleighs, as you may have heard, which might have been, sounds fun, but it probably wasn't that much fun out there. But this is the route he would have taken. You can see Coeymans highlighted up to Albany, and they crossed the Mohawk at Schenectady and traveled along the northern edge of the Mohawk out to Fort Johnson.
The green line?
Pardon
Is
me?
it the green line?
No, the red one.
Oh, the red one.
Yeah, Coeymans is way down there on the right. So that thin, my lines get thicker later in the presentation. That was a pretty thin line, but you go up to Albany from Coeymans and over to Schenectady. So on January 20th of 76, General Schuyler and Colonel Nicholas Herkimer, with a force of over 3,000 troops, moved into Johnstown, and the surrender took place the following day. So it was a big mass of troops coming, 3,000 of them. Sir John Johnson was put on parole, and then later in May they chased him out again as he tried to reinvigorate the loyalists out in Johnstown to attack the Albany area. So yeah, the red line shows the pass from Queens to Fort Johnson. You got Albany underlined and Schenectady and then Fort Johnson up there. So that was 1776 going into Johnstown. Some of the earliest action that the soldiers saw around here. So now we're going to get up to northern New York in anticipation of Burgoyne's coming south. So here, so as you can see, stated here, after invading Canada in late 1775, the American Continental Army had retreated from Quebec to Fort Ticonderoga and Fort Crown Point in June 76. The American Army spent the summer of 76 fortifying their forts, refortifying the forts, and building additional ships to augment the small American fleet already on Lake Champlain. By early October 76, the British fleet, which significantly outgunned the American fleet, was ready for launch. Forces would meet about Boar Island on October the 11th. So once again, here's a little more about Private Cornelius de Groot. We're going to follow his path up north. He enlisted in May of 76 for 5 months, and he headed up to Fort Edward and I think Fort Miller, and we'll hear his voice here.
In May 1776, a requisition was made when I resided at Coeymans for a certain number of men. The company that I belonged to started a draft, and I was drafted for 5 months' service and was mustered at Albany. Immediately after, I was drafted in a company commanded by Captain Abraham Vetter and Lieutenants Hagen and Slingerland, and was attached to a regiment commanded by Colonel Cornelius Van Dyke. I marched directly to a place called Fort George and was garrisoned there for a fortnight or more. From there, I marched to Ticonderoga, where I stayed on duty about 3 weeks or a month. From there, I marched to Skenesboro and stayed about 2 months guarding the workmen who were employed in building row galleys. And then to Fort Miller on the North River. I was ordered by Colonel Van Dyke to remain there with 12 men to assist in bringing provisions and stores from Saratoga Landing to Fort Miller Falls. I remained on the work duty for about 7 or 8 weeks until my enlistment expired, and I was discharged by Colonel Van Dyke by word of mouth. I served in that term of service the full term of 5 months. I then went home to Coeymans.
So that's taken straight from Cornelius de Groot's testimony in his pension file, yeah. I think I looked it up. Fort Ticonderoga from here is almost 120 miles, so it's a long march. And a lot of them, a lot of their action was local, but they also enrolled, like I said, between 3 and 6 months. This was for 5 months. And he got a lot of marching in. So within the pension files, you'll find corroborating evidence or substantiation for a soldier's service. So here we got from 1833, Isaac D. Verplank, that he has been acquainted with Cornelius ever since his boyhood, and that he resided with Cornelius de Groot in Coeymans during the Revolution. Isaac said that he and Cornelius de Groot were drafted for a 5-month term of service in the spring of 76, and they went to Albany to muster. At Albany, Isaac was informed that his uncle, who resides there, procured a substitute for him, and he did not march north to Fort George, where the regiment was ordered, but Cornelius de Groot did continue with his regiment. So Isaac Verplank's uncle got him a substitute so that he didn't have to go forward up to the North Country. And then also Conrad T. Teneyfe states in the pension file that he has known Cornelius de Groot as a resident of Coeymans for at least 60 years, and Cornelius de Groot was drafted in 76. And Conrad was at a place called Fort Miller in the forepart of the fall after de Groot was drafted, and saw him on duty as a soldier in the fall of 76. So it kind of helps make all the connections come together with other people in the town of, in the Coeymans Patent area that we're serving. At that time, even though they don't have pensions, we can tell that they were serving in different places.
Now, is that Cornelius's actual writing there?
No, that would be like a lawyer or some kind of,
Oh, okay.
he would be sitting there telling,
And somebody else was transcribing?
like not a lawyer, or somebody like a lawyer, yeah, or a public notary, but mostly probably more like a pension lawyer that they had at the time to help these pensioners, because it was advertised in papers that these, the pensions out there, these pension acts have been updated and that people are eligible. So they would have lawyers kind of soliciting business. So, yeah, that would be the lawyers writing, and they would just take the pensioner's word. I don't think they were allowed to coach them. I don't think they were allowed to, coach them. It's all, because some of these have, today would see a blatant mistake saying something happened on a certain day when we know it didn't happen, but their memory is bad. You can tell they're not being coached all the time, because if it's wrong, it's, listed as wrong, but that's, like Cornelius de Groot throughout his testimony, he kind of gets mixed up because he's 80 and it's been a while, and he didn't know, he had to know all the details of how many days and who was with him and all that. So you do see mistakes in some of them, but on the other hand, Levi Blazo, we'll get more into him, he obviously kept a diary or a journal of some sort, because he knows everything. He has all these dates and all these times and places that you wouldn't remember, 50 years later that well.
Kyle,
Yeah,
the Levi, or no, Isaac, or Plank,
Isaac.
to make it more real for everybody, I think that's where the Collins family is now, on 143.
Collins Flats.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Well,
Collins Fuel Oil.
yeah, I think, we might have saw her Plank name on the Bleecker map from 1767,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
Andre's widow, Whitback, thank you. So any other questions? So let's get back to Levi. And Levi, he's still in Amesbury, and from April through December of '76, his testimony states that and marched from Amesbury to Fort Ticonderoga and was there in garrison, out on a fatigue party, and assisted in constructing a floating bridge fastened by anchors and cables across the lake to Fort Independence. Later assisted in making bricks for the barrack chimney. So I think I saw some of that on the Ken Burns, where they showed the floating bridge on a graphic during that show that was fastened by anchors and cables across the lake. Then from Fort Ticonderoga, from there to Old Skeensboro, where he assisted in the building of the galley called the Gates. A galley is a boat. And remained there until December. Then returned to Amesbury by way of Fort Anne and Albany. So you see the blue line going up through New Hampshire. It's about 200 and some miles from Amesbury to Fort Ticonderoga. And then you see the green loop back, again down through, maybe through Kinderhook and maybe along what might be today's Massachusetts Turnpike, that green line through the bottom there. And so also the V way on top, that's where Valcour Island was. So as he was here, April through December, helping making boats and row galleys, the battle took place in October. And at that battle, the British were pretty much successful in winning, but they were successful in winning. They pretty much destroyed the fleet led by Benedict Arnold. But the Americans gained a strategic victory with this battle. The British invasion was delayed long enough so the approach of winter prevented the fall of forts to the south until the following year. But in that time, the Continental Army gained strength. They effectively obstructed Burgoyne's march south that year and secured defensive positions that led to victory at Saratoga. So all these little things did seem to kind of add up, maybe in the lucky side. So let's get into some of the Western Greenland's patent area and some of the activity in the patrols by the Rangers out there. Again, this just is one of the maps that are out there, and I've labeled along the Hannacoy where Aqueduct, Alcove, and Indian Fields would be. So these are the 4 soldiers we're going to be following through their pension records for activity at Indian Fields and Passaic, Westerlo. So Passaic is new to me, and we'll get into where that came from. But we got Martin Van Buren, I just mentioned, maybe related to the president, but wasn't his father, wasn't directly related to him. He moved to Coeymans in the 20s, and he died there in 1840. And Private John Vanderpool, pretty much the same scenario with Private Van Buren, where he was resided in Skodak during the war, and moved to Coeymans prior to 1820, and died here in 1836. We got Private Cornelius de Groot, who was born in 1757 and lived here during the war for many years, and he died at the almshouse, Albany Almshouse, in 1837. And the fourth pensioner will follow Sergeant Nathan Cutler. He was born 1758, and he lived in Williamsburg during the war. And by 1790, he had moved west, like a lot of the pensioners did with the land grants that they were given after the war. He died in 1838 at Mill Porch, Monk County. So the PASIC or Passaic or the different variations of that word came up in many of the pension files, and they would instantly say today's Westerlo. So it might say we went to Passaic or PASIC, which is today's Westerlo. So part of this 1969 book by Colonel Haney on the Haney family, he describes the area was now becoming more settled. In 1794, Andrew Haney acquired a large tract of land, principally covered with timber lying on both sides of what was then called the Passaic Creek, now the Basic Creek. So the Indians from the time would have they called that creek the Passaic, or close to Basic, where we changed, the English changed it to Basic, or the new people living in the area, which might have been the kind of similar sounding as Passaic, but again, the variations in the spelling are, everything you can imagine, but generally revolve around Passaic or Passaic, and it's again mentioned in a lot of the, at least 3 or 4 of the pension files of going out to Passaic, so it wasn't known as Westerlo. Of course, Westerlo was never created until 1815 when part of Coeymans and part of Rensselaerville got apportioned to Greene County. Okay, I click this and that way. So here's a map again, the Indian Fields and Passaic or Westerlo area. So this Westerlo is probably a little closer to where the 2 creeks split, not so far up on the edge there, but in Indian Fields, again, the flatlands out along the Hanacroy after it goes through those hills. So Indian Fields, a lot of you probably know this, is located just west of the Hanacroy, passes a notch in the hills, and in 1928, the flatlands west of the notch would be purchased and later flooded by the city of Albany to create the Alcove Reservoir. And out by Westerlo, like I mentioned, came from Colonel Haney's 1969 book describing that land area as being referred to Passaic Creek, now Basic Creek, and no doubt many generations of the Haneys continued Andrew's pioneering spirit. Some of the roots out there throughout the Westerlo area that, not sure if they're still out there, but I think the Haney name is definitely in some of the company names out there.
Were the pensions based on the ranks?
No, well, you mean your...
Would you get more pensions
yeah.
if you were higher rank?
Yeah, it was sort of, yes, it was. Yeah, not much.
Oh, not much.
No. Yeah, well, we see it wasn't much to begin with, and
No, it wasn't. That's
but
what
it would just be minimal increment higher, not too much, and they weren't really paid that much more to be a lieutenant or any of the other. In fact, a lot of times they weren't paid at all. So here we got the Albany Committee of Safety, and this is one of their proceedings. This is a normal thing they did, is they took information from the public. Here's a statement they made in March of '78 that says, the committee were informed that there are a number of persons gathered together at a place called Piecing with the intent to join the enemy when an opportunity offers. Therefore resolved that a party be sent to apprehend and secure the said persons. And so that was a typical type of entry, maybe not for that area of the county, but it was normal for this Albany Committee of Safety to receive reports of people either disaffected or loyalists. A disaffected person was someone that just didn't want nothing to do with anything. They didn't want to be here, or they wanted to be here, but they didn't want to be for the Patriots or the Americans, and they didn't want to be for the loyalists. They just kind of wanted to be left alone. But that was not acceptable, and everybody either had to sign through this, if you're brought into the Albany Committee of Safety and questioned for being a loyalist or disaffected, they would require you to sign some type of statement saying, I'm for the Patriot cause. And then we'll need to go out on service and do some military service, because that was the other part of the catch, that you had to do military service. So, let's see. Yeah, so the committee would receive reports from, either the military or citizens of anyone suspected of not being for the cause, and they would organize and get the military to go out to these areas and do some patrols to see what's going on out there and if there's any unusual activity. So let's get into Martin Van Buren. He stated in his testimony that he enlisted at home in Skodak about August 1st of 1776 as a private in a company of Rangers commanded by Captain Alexander Baldwin and First Lieutenant Lyman Jackson. And he mustered soon after in Albany, went immediately on duty, first sent to Indian Fields, near what is now the village of Coeymans, and then to Passaic, now Westerlo, Albany County. After serving about 3.5 months, Private Van Buren was taken sick and remained home until April of '77. And also, Private John Vanderpool was in that same company of Rangers, and he says pretty much the same thing, that he enlisted in August with Baldwin's Rangers in Skodak and was sent out scouting parties to search out and apprehend Tories at Indian Fields. And after reaching Indian Fields, Private John Vanderpool continued with Baldwin's Rangers to the then called Passaic area, then called Passaic, today's Westerlo area. So they both were on the same patrol of Rangers. What they were doing, I don't know, but probably just looking to see if there's any, maybe ammunition stores that were built up, or just, I wouldn't doubt they went to people's houses and maybe just checked to make sure it was for the cause, or signed, maybe any of the necessary allegiances that were required back to be with the Patriots. So now, let's move on to Cornelius de Groot again. We have another voice.
I returned to Coeymans about May 20th, 1777, where I remained but a few days when my company was again ordered out en masse. As before, I went with them under Lieutenant Commandant Van Antwerp to the western part of the county of Albany at a place called Passaic to apprehend the Tories and other disaffected persons. I was on duty at that time 3 weeks.
All right. So about the same time that he's going out in May '77, we come across documents like this. This is Ensign Cornelius Coeymans van der Zee. And this pay record shows him from May of 12 to 16 of '77 with the Albany County Militia to apprehend Tories. And if you can read that pay card, so first off, these pay cards came from the Comptroller's office about 100 years after the war. They went through their files and realized they don't really have a good accounting or even knowing who was in the war for New York and trying to represent the soldiers that were here. And they went through, in the late 1800s, went through all these old war rolls, or muster rolls, and they made these documents up. The person was paid, it's shown the dates of service. If you can read there, it says of Captain William Winnie's company of Colonel G. Vandenberg's regiment of Albany militia to apprehend Tories. So he was probably one of the soldiers that would have gone out en masse to see what was going on out towards Westerlo and Indian Fields. So we do have this, that he was born on his father's farm on Row Road in Fairbush in 1740. He married Agnes Whitbeck in 1763, about 1780. We think they moved with their 4 children to the Aqueduct section of Coeymans Patent, and they built a small log cabin for the family's first residence and began farming on their land. His son Andrew Van der Zee carried on the family farm after the death of the parents. The farm remained as a family-run enterprise for over 200 years, and today the original Van der Zee farming tradition remains in Aqueduct as nearby family with their own deep roots in local farming continues to farm the land, so that the familiar sights and sounds of farming continues to live today on Van der Zee Road. And the smells, all the good ones. It's a great place to get by and to see all the old structures there. But yet, besides having the pensioners, again, some of these, there's all these other records available through research, of course, that help kind of put some of this stuff together. So, Here's
And
another
about
one.
the 1st of August, 1777, volunteered under the same captain, James Waldron, for 2 months as an Indian spy. I served in the vicinity of Pasek and Schoharie the full time and was dismissed.
So Sergeant Nathan Cutler was an Indian spy, again, I guess maybe out on his own, just patrolling, just seeing if there was anything going on. That was noteworthy. We're about halfway through, so that's good. We're at the Saratoga campaign, the big event of '77 in the area. That's Thaddeus Kosciuszko, one of the kind of like general contractors for the war, where he went everywhere as before all the soldiers got there to get the place ready for people to eat, sleep, and fight. So let's take a look at this now. This is the British Army's three-pronged attack that they planned for the '77 campaign, and it's pretty clear. You can see from that map down from Quebec, Burgoyne was going to come down to Champlain and Hudson Valleys, while St. Leger was going to take the St. Lawrence River and come into Lake Ontario and then traverse eastward to the Mohawk to pinch us that way, and then up from the south would have been Howe. The plan sort of was ahead of time to kind of do something like that by the British. But again, communications and things go on. It didn't actually happen that way. But the point was to get to Albany in order to split the rebellious New England Yankees away from the rest of the colonies. So New England and Boston and Massachusetts was considered the most rebellious, while the Hudson Valley and lots of New York was sort of seen as maybe friendly to the Brits. They might have seen that they might have had a lot more allies or people that would join in on the fight as they came down. So, go from that. Here are the soldiers we're going to be looking at during the '77 campaign. We got Private John Jones is one of our pensioners that, unbeknownst to me, was another person that lived in Coeymans at the time. Private Joseph Berry, who was a pensioner from the 1818 Act. Ensign Levi Blaisdell again, Private Cornelius de Groot, Private Van Buren, Private Vanderpool, and Sergeant Nathan Cutler. We'll hear from some of those people and see their testimony during the '77 campaign. And a few others listed at the bottom. Some are local and some are coming through towards the end of the war and marching through home from Saratoga. So that's a map of the key forts we have. The furthest north, number one, would be Crown Point, that was evacuated in October '76 during the Battle of Valcour. And then we got Fort Ticonderoga, Fort George at the foot of Lake George, Fort Edward, Fort Miller, Saratoga, Stillwater. And then Van Skyke Island would be where the Mohawk meets the Hudson and Cohoes. And that was the major headquarters, so to speak, for the Northern Army of the United States, and that's where they all congregated.
I
Another voice.
operated at home until the following spring. I was again enrolled in a company of militia at Coeymans under the command of Captain David McCarty and attached to a regiment commanded by Colonel Garrett Vandenberg. I was ordered out and marched from Coeymans to Stillwater and Fort Edward, a distance of 60 or 70 miles. I remained on duty at that time 1 month.
So again, a lot of marching, a lot of going to these places where it's, they're repairing forts, they're getting probably redoubts ready for the war as Burgoyne floods south. Here's a quick look at this. He's in yellow there. He goes up to these two forts.
They probably needed new boots by now.
I don't know. They had.
In the winter following.
Oh, sorry, another
moved to
voice.
Coeymans in Albany County, and in the month of May, 1777, I volunteered for 3 months in the company of James Waldron, captain in the New York militia, to go to the north when Burgoyne was coming down. Conrad Van Eyck was a commanding officer, and we first marched to Saratoga, then to Fort Miller and Fort Edward, and remained about 2 months. And then the captain and company returned.
Yeah, I gotta be better prepared for my voices coming on. I had my notes, but I think you all heard that all right. Right.
It's good.
And so again, Sergeant Cutler, there's a quick map showing his routes. And here we got another map now. This is this is a map showing Burgoyne's progress south. Their army departed St. John's, Canada at the northern end of Lake Champlain on June 13th, so by July 5th, they're already down into past Crown Point, Fort Ticonderoga, Skeensboro. By the 8th, they were into Fort Anne and heading on down towards Fort Edward there, so they're making good progress. The Americans basically just evacuated all their forts ahead of Burgoyne coming, rather than trying to put up a fight that they knew they wouldn't win. They evacuated southward and saved their fight for another day. But at this time, the retreat of the Americans, we came up with some tactics to delay the British. General Schuyler, after hearing of the loss at Fort Ticonderoga, immediately rode up to Fort Edward, where there was a garrison of about 700 regulars and 1,400 militia. He had to get them out of there into the south, but he also decided to make Burgoyne's passage as difficult as possible, like chopping down and leaving large trees on Burgoyne's path. And this would bring Burgoyne's advance to a crawl, tiring his troops and forcing them to use supplies, and doing some of this work in the summer, and knowing what July up in the Adirondacks, it must be like trying to march through those woods and
With the bugs.
yeah, and the bugs and everything else, and trying to make your way, while at the same time the path is just littered with trees. They did everything they could to destroy bridges, even reroute streams to just make their southward trek more difficult. You'll see Burgoyne saying in July 11th how he wrote to Lord Germain complaining that the Americans were systematically felling trees, destroying bridges, damming streams along the road to Fort Edward. Schuyler also employed scorched earth tactics to deny the British access to local provisions. Schuyler's tactics required Burgoyne to build a road through the wilderness for his guns and troops. And it was a task that would take 2 weeks just to get that short distance. And we got some testimony from John Jones here. He was born in Albany in 1752, and he lived in the Baltimore section of Queens Patton during the war. He volunteered in the town of Baltimore and joined Captain Van Skyke's company about the last of May or early June of 1777. Private Jones marched north to Fort Edward, then to Fort Anne, where he cut trees and fell them across the road. Later, Private Jones marched down to Stillwater, where he helped dig a trench until his term expired about the 1st of September of 77 and returned home. So he was part of one of the crews that would have been up there trying to make the path as difficult as possible in the middle of summer. It's a lot of these guys, again, they're master woodsmen, they're master lumbermen, they know what they're doing. It's easy, I think, to wreck a trail, and it's a lot of work to clean up a trail, I think, if it's purposely done like that. So they did all they could, the Americans, to kind of retard his Burgoyne's march south. So you'll see John Jones marches to the north in the yellow, and at the same time, he's there up till September, so the Burgoyne's British troops did make a lot of progress getting south by that time. He probably would have heard some of them coming along. So next we have Martin Van Buren. So he's up north in July of August of 77. And this is a time when all our troops are retreating. So for 6 weeks, he was at Fort Edward, or Snook Hill, and retreating to Saratoga. During that time, he alternately drove a wagon and carried musket and stood sentinel, mounted picket guard. Then after about 6 weeks, Private Van Buren then accompanied Lieutenant Philip Stotts, who was wounded at Snook Hill, and was wounded at Snook Hill below Fort Edward, to Philip Van Rensselaer's home on South Pearl Street in Albany. So he assisted one of his injured soldier mates and down to Philip Van Rensselaer's house to kind of act as a hospital for the time. So again, he's moving up north and the British are coming down, and he retreats, and all the Americans are retreating at this time in the middle of July, going into August. They're all coming down towards Saratoga, maybe even congregating at Van Skyke Island. So we're going to have some first-hand accounts today. So this, besides the other pension records, within pension records, or in this case, It's from testimony from Peter Ostrander's widow, Christina. The deponent, the person speaking here, was Peter Hotelling, who was 86 at this time. And he attested in 1853. He's recalling back to 1777 when he was only 10. But he gives us some information throughout his testimony that we'll be using later. First, he's just indicating that the Peter Ostrander family, composed of his wife, Christina, and children, resided only a few rods from Peter's father, and that Peter saw them every day. And that during the whole Revolutionary War, of which Peter has a distinct recollection, as his father and several of his friends and relatives, neighbors were engaged in it and were at times absent from home for months. And that Peter Ostrander frequently spent whole evenings with Peter's father and talking over the chances of war and continuing means for support and protection of their families during his absence. So Peter Holtelling's father was Captain Thomas Holtelling, and they were neighbors again of those Stranders down in Baltimore. And Captain Holtelling was the captain of the 11th Regiment coming out of Coxsackie, and he was one of the signers of the Coxsackie Declaration that was written back in 1775, kind of like a precursor for the Declaration of Independence that we signed off on in 1776. So he was an influential man down in the Baltimore area. So let's go on to Private Hilton here. And it's more retreating, and so Private Hilton and his regiment retreated from Fort Ticonderoga to Lake George to Fort Edward to Fort Millard to Saratoga and Stillwater to the island facing Troy, which is Van Skyke Island. So we just have this whole general, retreat going on during this time. We see the British coming, and here's another map. So even though they started early June, by July 31st, he's already captured all these forts. And again, we're pretty much evacuating. We're not staying up and fighting for these forts just because they're outnumbered. And so by, again, July 31st, we see that he's coming down good. And then also there's still the push coming from the west. As I mentioned earlier, St. Ledger's going to come down through the St. Lawrence River. And he's going to pinch them in through the west. So on August 1st, St. Ledger was at Fort Stanwix. He was defeated and pushed back from there. And now by August 1st, too, we can see Burgoyne is on his way towards Saratoga. HQ would be where the Van Skyke Island is. So they had their plan in motion. We didn't see anything coming up from the south at this point. So, but another big thing that happened now in August is when Gates replaced Schuyler. Schuyler was a New York local and was well liked by all the New Yorkers. But Gates also had a lot of political pull, and he took command of the Northern Department. He arrives at the headquarters in Van Skyke Island, Cohoes. It's noted that Gates arrived and take charge, and he was cold and arrogant. It's kind of the type of thing we get about Gates a lot of times when you read about him. It says he excluded Schuyler from his first war council. General Schuyler left for Philadelphia shortly after depriving Gates of his intimate knowledge of the area. Throughout August and continuing into September, militia companies arrived at the Continental Army camps on the Hudson River. These were augmented by troops Washington ordered north from the Hudson Highlands as part of Arnold's operation to relieve Fort Stanwix. These troops arrived at the end of August and included sharpshooters of Daniel Morgan's rifles. So this is an important time now. We got all the troops coming south. Here's testimony from Jacob Hilton's pension. His cousin Derek states that it was, as the opponent thinks, about the middle of August that General Gates arrived at the camp in said island, Van Skyke, and took command of the troops, and immediately the army increased from 4 to nearly 13,000 men. So people were leaving. The Yankees from New England didn't want to serve under Schuyler, the New Yorker. They would rather, I think Gates may have come from New England, but they did not want anything to do with serving under Schuyler. They were leaving. They were walking up Hoosick Street in Troy and heading home. So in mid-August, the retreating troops, American troops from the north, congregate with arriving militias from the east and south at the mouth of the Mohawk on Van Skyke Island. So Gates takes command and from Schuyler and unifies the dissenting Yankee troops, and they come back. So if Schuyler was to stay on, we would have lost. And this is a pretty accurate estimate. I looked through some other research, and what Derek Hilton states, that the island went from 4,000 to 13,000 men, is an accurate statement, and that we had big problems if Schuyler was going to remain as the general of the Northern Department. So they did come back, and they did increase our troop sizes from, you know, people leaving to go home, go back to Boston, to go back and protect their families and take care of their homes and not serve for General Schuyler. So after that, again, here we are in early September, we're really getting close to the battles of Saratoga. We can see the British are all the way down through Fort Edward, Fort Miller. Number 6 is Saratoga. They're ready to knock on the door there. And the Americans, again, like I said, they're retreating. They're going down towards Saratoga and Stillwater and Bemis Heights, and starting to dig in for the first battle at Freeman's Farm, September 19th. But before all that, get this out of General Burgoyne's orderly book. At the beginning of September, Burgoyne had learned of St. Ledger's failure at Fort Stanwix. And even earlier, that Howe would not be giving him substantial support from the south, faced with dwindling resources and the need to reach defensible winter quarters, which would require either retreat back to Ticonderoga or advance to Albany. Burgoyne decides on the latter. He wants to head to Albany. But in his orderly book, on the day before the first Battle of Saratoga, in an attempt to stop soldiers from foraging for food and deserting, one line in his book states, "The life of the soldier is the property of the king," and that the first soldier caught beyond the advanced sentries will be instantly hanged. So they had a problem keeping soldiers. I didn't mention they went down to Bennington to get provisions and get animals and just get some foraging to help feed their troops, because their supply line went. The actual wagon train behind their army was 3 or 4 miles long, of just wagons supplying food and nourishment for their soldiers. So they had a long supply line that they were running out of food. They didn't get any in Bennington on their march down there. So they are in some tough situations here. So let's see, I want to make sure I'm not going to get into a voice before I'm ready for it. But here's the first battle, a simple map. These are some of the local soldiers. Private Jones, he states how he was, Private Jones came home September 1st and turned right around and enlisted again in September with Captain Holtelling's company and Colonel Van Bergen's regiment, and marched immediately in September to Bemis Heights. John Vanderpool, which Kodak mentions the same thing, pretty much joined the American Army at Stillwater. He was attached to a regiment commanded by Colonel Wemple of Schenectady, then an old man at 52 years old. And Martin Van Buren, about the 28th of August, the same year, he marched up to Stillwater. So we see we got a lot of the soldiers there at the first battle, at least some of the pensioners that we know of. Get onto the right page here. So here we're going to hear from Peter again. Peter Holtelling states how he recollects his father starting a company with the said Peter Ostrander and others to join the army a short time previous to the battle. And he recollects hearing the sound of distant cannonades. So even down to Baltimore, it's known that they heard the cannons in Albany, and so I guess maybe you were hearing cannon shots all the way down to the Baltimore from Saratoga.
Probably the water.
Yeah, or the valley, yep. Yep. So at this time, we get some simultaneous attack up at Saratoga. So, you know, mostly it was unknown to either side, at least the soldiers at Saratoga, that an attack against the British, against their rear guard, was going to happen at Fort Ticonderoga. So we're going to listen to Levi Blaisdell now on his trip from Amesbury up to Lake George.
In 1777, I enlisted the third time for 9 months in Amesbury, Massachusetts, and was made a sergeant in Colonel Johnson's regiment. I marched from Andover, Mass. Under General Stark to Paulette, Vermont, and thence to Lake George, where, as the oldest orderly, I was ordered with a guard to take charge of the baggage and stores whilst the Army went to attack Fort Block near Diamond Island on Lake George, which they took and made prisoners of the British garrison in the fort with a loss of but one man in my company. Then returned back to Paulette, and from there to Bemis Heights.
So Levi was engaged in going, once again, from Mainsbury, and he was attached to troops that attacked the British rear. And so once again, you see him going up to Lake George. It's about 215 miles. It was a big strategic victory for the Americans, as the British, again, their supply line was dwindling, and this was attacking the rear of their line, and it was a big success. And like I said, mostly unknown to anyone going on in Saratoga that this was going to go on through and that they were going to be so successful up here. Now here's Caesar Egberts, who was 84-year-old resident of New Baltimore in 1853. Caesar has a clear and distinct recollection of the Revolutionary War and the hardships and suffering experienced by those families in the neighborhood when male members were engaged in it during its continuance. He recollects particularly the time of burning at Kingston and the capture of General Burgoyne. Given the fact that at the time there was hardly an able-bodied man at home in town, and the great fear which was entertained by women and slaves of being massacred by the Indians and Tories. So it was a common scene, not only here but everywhere throughout the colonies, I suspect. When the pressure was on, all the men were out engaged in soldiering and left behind with the women and children and the not so able-bodied people to protect themselves. And there was a lot of fear going on, and again, when you hear cannons and just everything going on, I'm sure there was a lot of anxiety going on at that time. So, okay. So now we're going to get into the Second Battle of Saratoga. These are some of the pensioners these are the pensioners that we know were there from the local area. Again, Private Van Buren and Van der Poel, Private Jones, Ensign Levi Blaisdell, Private Buren. As we just noted, Captain Hotelling's company was up at this Second Battle of Bemis Heights.
Regiments to which I belong were encamped on the parade west of the fort. On the drums beating to arms, Colonel Johnson's regiment was ordered to reinforce Colonel Morgan and Colonel Sullivan, whose regiments were stationed on the right of Colonel Johnson's. Then marched on the road through the woods whilst 3 artillery pieces were firing upon us. We were ordered by General Arnold to take, and which the order was no sooner given than it was obeyed. In taking the 3 field pieces, 12 British artillerymen who were with the pieces ran into a small log house in which one of them cried out for quarters, which on stacking their arms as ordered was granted to them, and they taken prisoners and brought into the proper quarters. On this occasion, General Arnold rode up on full gallop across the British entrenchments, hollowing out, "Come on, my boys, come on, the day is our own." And whilst animating and encouraging our troops, that general received his wound in the ankle or leg, which also wounded his horse. The Americans then pursued the British on their retreat, and in the pursuit took the kettles from their fires, and throwing out the liqueur, satisfied their craving appetites with the provisions prepared for their conquerors, and eating as they pursued, and overtook them. The night coming on, the American army were ordered to retreat back to Bemis Heights. The next day, the flag truce was sent in by the enemy. Levi Blaisdell, October 1777.
That's pretty exciting, I thought, coming across that. He was obviously right on the line. And again, a diary, I think, helps to have all that detailed information and to identify Arnold in the turning point, actually, of that battle, where he crashed through the line and the American troops got in through the redoubt that actually held by the Hessians of the Burgoyne's army. And, quite an exciting time.
Is an ensign, like captain or something?
It's nautical, and
What's
even
an
though,
ensign? I never heard of it.
yeah, it's like a navy, even though I'm
Oh,
not sure if we had a navy officially. I think the navy was created during the Revolutionary War, but we use those titles here because there were a lot of boats still being made and used on the Hudson.
But it wasn't more of the, wasn't an officer, no.
Well, I think it is. Well, if a lieutenant's an officer, yeah, I think an ensign would be considered a commissioned officer, I should say. And again, it does seem like they're out of order on all this land, but there were a lot of maritime, the lakes, a lot of the fighting was done on Lake George and Lake Champlain, and the row galleys and boats like that were created. So and he might have had some nautical background too from Amesbury.
Boats, I think.
Yeah. But no, that was quite exciting to come across that and find that in Levi Blaisdell's testimony. And he goes on, he was at the surrender, as well as these other gentlemen, Private Jones, Private Vanderpool, Private Van Buren. And now we're gonna listen to Levi one more time.
When the British commenced their march for the purposes of capitulation, which ceremony I had the pleasure of witnessing, and on the moment after they had crossed the line of demarcation, the American music commenced playing Yankee Doodle, and continued that tune until the British had passed through the American lines. Colonel Johnson's regiment marched back to Bemis Heights, having lost, killed, or wounded 36, as appeared by the returns. Shortly after which the regiment marched home through Albany to Amesbury.
So again, really exciting testimony you get from Levi. Yankee Doodle played as the British marched through the line. Had to be what a scene, what a scene.
You can imagine it.
Yeah. And again, to have this information, Levi died less than a year after he did all this testimony, so, it's really exciting to see it, to have it, and to be able to apply it to our local history, not only Levi, but the others out there. So, once again, let's go back to Peter Hotelling. Again, he's recollecting when he was 10 years old, now that he's 86, that the opponent recollects as well as though it's been yesterday, the time of the surrender of the company of General Burgoyne to that of General Gates. He recollects when the express rider came down with the news that Burgoyne had surrendered, and how the evening the neighboring women met at his father's house and inquired for news, and how many of them were greatly charmed, for the fear their husbands and friends had been killed. So, yeah, again, you're learning different things, or I'm trying to learn different things too. Like express riders, I guess, weren't really many newspapers at the time, and if you were to get one, it would have came through an express rider. But where they went, well, they would have went on these roads, but where they stopped might have been just any crossroad or anywhere there's a tavern, maybe to leave a printed piece of paper or something announcing the victory. But it must have been, quite a time in Coeymans there like no other, as far as having all this excitement and fear at the same time. So let's look at after the surrender. The American troops still had a lot of work to do. Alerted to Clinton's raids on the Hudson, most of the army marched south towards Albany on October 18th, right after the surrender, while other detachments accompanied the Convention Army, the British prisoners, to the east. So all the British prisoners were called the Convention Army. The Convention Army was kept for some time in sparse camps throughout New England. Although individual officers were exchanged, much of the Convention Army was eventually marched south to Virginia, where it remained prisoner for several years. Throughout its captivity, a large number of men, 1,300 alone the first year, escaped, effectively deserted and settled in the United States. A lot of the Hessians was noted for deserting, and they were hired soldiers. The Hessians came from countries that just made soldiers. They brought their men up to be soldiers, and they were part of the troops for Burgoyne's march in the British Army. So now this is Private Richard Collier from Coxsackie. So this is after the surrender. October 77, about the 1st of October, Private Collier was ordered out from Coxsackie for the purpose of guarding the banks of the Hudson for about 4 weeks, and until after the news of the surrender of Burgoyne, when they were dismissed and returned home. So until they heard Burgoyne surrender, there were soldiers posted on the banks of the Hudson, maybe waiting for the northern, waiting for Howe to come up from Hudson, from the south, and coming up that way. So there was a lot of anxiety still going on. And he did come up. Kingston and Livingston Manor attacked by the British in the middle of October after the surrender of Burgoyne. "We are hellishly frightened," said New York legislator Governor Morris wrote from Kingston. The legislators adjourned and hurried home to protect their families. Kingston residents began to flee. On Wednesday the 15th, General Vaughan's forces anchored a few miles south of Kingston. And on the 16th, the British ships opened fire on American defenders on the shore, maybe somebody like Private Collier just standing there with a gun. That's all we had to defend ourselves. The Patriots shot back from what is now Kingston Point, but could only mount a token resistance before retreating. The British went on to go 10 miles further north up to the estate of wealthy grandee Robert Livingston. The British burned the family mansion and 24 other buildings that chastised the Livingstons who had sided with the Patriots. The British then held their position waiting for word from the north. They're waiting to hear how Burgoyne's doing, and they finally found out he surrendered 6 days earlier and had surrendered the whole army to Horatio Gates. This defeat, again, that goes down as a critical turning point in the war. So here's a letter from John Lansing to General Philip Schuyler. Lansing states that, in a letter dated October 29th, that the British Army had burned Livingston Manor in Columbia County, and on Saturday we're at Catskill, have since returned to Poughkeepsie. So I think, Livingston Manor and Catskill are about the same location on the Hudson on opposite sides, but they weren't far from here. Catskill, to see those ships, would have been quite a fear, even if their armies are surrendering. Just to see them there had to be quite a stress on the people in the area.
I wonder if they killed the Livingstons.
No, they burned everything. I think they escaped, but no. So that was the good part. So now let's listen to Cornelius again.
That the same year, October 1777, the town of Esopus, or Kingston, was burned. And a few days before the burning of that place by the British, but what year I cannot now recollect, I was ordered out with the rest of the company of militia under Captain McCarty and went to Esopus, now Kingston, on the North River, when the British fleet was up said river. I was on duty 7 days. I think it was in the forepart of the fall of the year 1777. Soon after I returned from that tour, Captain McCarty gave up the command of the company, and Captain Van Antwerp took it.
So, once again, we hear from Cornelius. He did have some problems with his memory, and as you might have heard on that, he's still unsure as he's speaking of that year. If he was coached, I think he would have had all the exact dates, and he would have known exactly when all these events occurred with some help, but you can tell they're not really, as who's taking these notes, as a court reporter, you're not supposed to coach the people, and so if they're wrong, you just let it go. Now this is Private Vanderpool after the surrender. Now he's accompanying the British prisoners to Albany, and then proceeded down the river as far as the Highlands, expecting to meet the South British Army, supposed to be on its way from New York. So he's bringing the prisoners to Albany. The prisoners head east towards Boston. He gets down south. He passes Esopus, now Kingston, soon after it was burnt by the British. Then came back to Albany, was discharged late in the fall. So he was with the prisoners coming south, and he also passed Esopus right after it burned. This is, so the Second Battle of Saratoga and the surrender happened early October, and here's a letter that George Washington's writing to the general. General Horatio Gates, he's 2 or 3 weeks after the battle, he's thanking Gates here. By this opportunity, I do myself the pleasure to congratulate you on the signal success of the Army under your command in compelling General Burgoyne and his whole force to surrender themselves prisoners of war. An event that does the highest honor to the American arms, and which I hope will be attended with the most extensive and happy consequences. At the same time, I cannot but regret that a matter of such magnitude and so interesting to our general operations should have reached me by report only, or through the channel of letters not bearing that authenticity which the importance of it required, in which it would have received by a line under your signature stating the simple facts. So Washington never heard from Gates about the victory at Saratoga. It may have been somebody's secretary told him, I don't know, maybe.
Compliment followed by a.
Yeah. Yes, we're very happy we won, and why didn't you tell me? So, yeah, and you read these things, and so Gates does come through as a politician. He does come through as maybe sometimes thinking more about his own benefits than what he's really, why he's serving here. But yes, it was a, I heard that before, and then to see this, yeah, that's, how nice can you write a letter telling someone, thanks for not telling me something.
A real compliment in the first paragraph.
Pardon me?
A real compliment followed by.
Yes, yeah, real compliment followed by why didn't
By
you tell me?
criticism.
So, now the last part of the whole presentation today. We're going to follow some troops coming down after Burgoyne's surrender. So through the last 3 months of 1777, we got troops marching south from Saratoga. From the journal of Captain Juduthan Baldwin, who was engineer with the Army, he mentions on October 20th, just we're a week or two after the, 17th was the surrender. A few days later, he's at Albany mending the roads on the west side of the river for 14 miles to allow the soldiers and the wagons and all the ammunition and stores to be carted down from Saratoga. And we're going to follow a little bit on Cornelius Emmendorf from Dutchess County, and Private Ephraim Hall from Connecticut, and Ensign Jonathan Libby from the Continental Army. So we got troops marching south after Burgoyne's surrender. We got Private Cornelius Emmendorf from Kingston. He resided in Rhinebeck during the war. He departed Albany in company with Morgan's Rifles on October 23rd, and they proceeded south through Coeymans, Coxsackie, Cosbon, which is Saugerties, and Kingston, and thence to Hurley, where they were discharged in the forepart of November. So we have a nice picture of Morgan's Rifles, and this would have been an exciting time coming through Queens. The town probably never saw such activity like this, of all these soldiers marching south.
Where's Hurley?
Hurley is down like in Orange County, down, not near West Point, but near West Point.
Or Ulster County.
Pardon me?
Ulster.
Ulster County, okay. It was a big spot for the Continental Army, though, for some reason. It was some type of central type of location where they...
They did a lot of walking.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. So here's Private Ephraim Hall from Mansfield, Connecticut. So the day after the surrender of Burgoyne, Private Hall marched from Saratoga to Albany and camped there for 2 weeks. About November 1st, to Coeymans Landing aboard a sloop and commenced preparation to go into winter quarters here. They remained in Coeymans for a few days when the orders were received to march, so they didn't stay here. They marched to Valley Forge and joined the main army under General Washington at Valley Forge. General Washington remained with the army at that place during the winter, according to Ephraim's testimony. He was Private Hall assisted in building a bridge across the Schuylkill while they were down at Valley Forge, and it was one of George Washington's exercises to keep the troops busy and working through that terrible winter. He mentions that it was 18 days on the march from Coeymans Landing to Philadelphia. So that's maybe some stops along the way, but 18 days marching through a really cold winter, which had to be cold up here too. I mean, it's not like we would have had much better weather than Valley Forge. So here's Ensign Jonathan Libby from Scarborough, Maine. He also states how they proceeded to Albany, where he lay until November 1st. Then traveled 12 miles down the river to Coeymans Overslaw, which was also part of this region's definition of the extra layer of sand in the overslaw near Coeymans, which slows or stops every boat going north or south. If the tide isn't just right, they all stop there. Then November 7th, embargoed on board of sloops and went down the river to King's Ferry and the Valley Forge. So we had a lot of the soldiers marching through, going right on down the Valley Forge for that winter of discontent down there. And also here you can see, this looks like Ensign Libby actually submitted his journal as part of his pension package. It's very common to also find ripped out pages from Bibles just to document your family's lineage. With no copying services, and apparently people didn't feel like they could just recopy something with a notary. They did a lot of Bibles and a lot of pages ripped right out of people's personal, and this is a personal journal that he submitted as part of his deposition. Probably never thought anybody'd see it again, but here we are 250 years later seeing this guy's journal right in his pension package. So, that is about it. We have, well, anybody have any questions? Is anybody doing any lineage research, or does anybody recognize any of the names you've been through? Oh, you're a Blaisdell, okay. Yeah, Levi had a lot of nice testimony, and I think it's known that they, okay. One last thing though, we'll show, these are Revolutionary War soldiers who moved to Coeymans Patent after the war. These are people that would have lived here a significant portion of the remainder of their lives here. Some of them are buried here if we know where they're buried. But let's go through it. Casparus Ackerman, he's up on our timeline out there for being one of the first mill owners or mill builders out in Alcove. John Anderson was a pensioner. Christopher Babcock, a pensioner. He's buried at the Parish Cemetery down in Coeymans off of Church Street. There's Joseph Berry, a pensioner. Nathan Brown, William Kerrigan, Anthony Egberts. I think his grandfather was a former governor of New York, or great-grandfather was one of the colonial governors of New York. There's Caleb Foster. John Gibbons was out by Westerlo, as was Josiah Hinckley. They resided out by Westerlo. Benjamin Jenkins. His children were some of the first baptized at the Coeymans Dutch Reformed Church after it opened Daniel Lake. You see Lawrence Lawson, probably the Lawsons that are out in the northwestern part of the town. James Litchfield, those names are, that's a name up from Blodgett Hill. The family moved into that area after the war. David Mead, I think there's a Mead's Corners, and probably maybe a originating settler for the name for that family. John Miller, I don't have much on him, but he was written up as coming over with Lafayette from France and settling in the Westerlo area after the war. Gideon Schofield, again, when Westerlo was part of Coeymans Patent, he was out in that part of Coeymans Patent. John P. Shear, I have a name, but I really haven't been able to find much about him, but other than he was with militias, and I haven't really been able to get much out of his research. Cornelius Swarthouse, again, Martin Van Buren and Vanderpool, they were both from Schodak, and they both moved here shortly after the war. James Waldman Jr., he's the one that is buried on his family burial ground at the RCS by the bus garage. Edward Weaver and Abraham Winston. We had two more people that went out towards the Westerlo area of Coeymans Patent after the war. So I'm sure some of these names are kind of familiar and some are unknown to all of us, but there's a lot more to be done. There's a lot of research that's associated with this. They hope to get more of this information out for everyone. And that, I think, well, let's look at what else we got here. Yes. The next presentation will be a week from today. No, a month from today. Coeymans and the Coeymans Revolutionary War Encampment next Sunday at 2. John Bonafide and Trip Howell as your presenters. And they came across a lot of new information that you think soldiers marching south through town is a big deal. Well, they're a big deal. They're going to come up with a lot more. Really surprising. Really is.
All right, thank you, Kyle.